Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Conflict Zone. Please subscribe and like my videos. Today we turn our focus to Belarus and ask the question, is Belarus the next Ukraine? War clouds gather over Minsk and beyond. We'll walk through the exterior, geographical, strategic setting, then the interior, domestic politics, society, institutions, then performance, military, economic, then safety features, what safeguards exist, then unique selling points, why this country matters in the conflict equation, then price of that relevance, and finally a conclusion summarizing what this all means. Starting with the exterior, Belarus lies in the heart of Eastern Europe, bordered by Russia to the east and northeast, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, Lithuania and Latvia to the northwest. Its strategic position is critical. Because of its geography, Belarus functions as a bridge between Russia and Ukraine and a flank for NATO states in the Baltic region. Analysts have emphasized that its position makes it the most likely stage for Vladimir Putin's next big foreign policy adventure. Furthermore, Belarus has long-standing military and economic ties with Russia. It hosts Russian troops, Russian weapons, shared infrastructure, and in 2022 it allowed its territory to be used as a staging ground for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The exterior, therefore, is one of geography, alignment, and potential vulnerability. Belarus is not just a passive neighbor, it is a frontline actor in a region at war. Next, the interior. This is the big section for us. We must examine Belarus's domestic politics, society, economy, civil-military relations, public mood, institutional structures. Firstly, politically, Belarus has been ruled for decades by Alexander Lukashenko, whose regime has suppressed opposition, managed elections with heavy state control, and cultivated a back in the USSR-style system. The 2022 constitutional referendum further cemented his hold. Changes to the constitution included enabling him to remain in office until 2035 and removing Belarus's nuclear freeze-own status so that host nation nuclear weapons became possible. Economically, Belarus is heavily dependent on Russia for energy markets subsidies. Analysts argue that whereas Ukraine in the past made a pivot westwards, Belarus remains locked into Russia's orbit, though that posture creates internal tensions. Socially, there have been major protest waves, notably following the 2020 election, and a strong opposition movement such as the one led by Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. These protests speak to a society that is not passive, though the regime has been successful in maintaining control. The civil-military interior is also interesting. Belarusian armed forces are smaller, less well-trained, less battle-hardened compared to Ukraine or Russia, and their political loyalty remains uncertain under extreme stress. Analysts highlight scenarios where if Belarus is forced into a war, the internal cohesion might crumble. In short, the interior of Belarus is one of authoritarian durability, but with underlying fault lines, a dependent economy, a small but restive opposition, a military that is subordinate and used as a tool of regime survival. That makes Belarus structurally less resilient than some would assume, but still more stable than many conflict-prone zones. Now turning to performance, how Belarus performs militarily, economically, diplomatically in the context of conflict risk. Militarily, Belarus has allowed Russia to use its territory for invasion of Ukraine, which makes it complicit in the war. At the same time, Belarus's own armed forces have not undertaken major offensive operations on their own, and their performance in a high-intensity war environment would likely be weak compared to that of Russia or Ukraine's forces. Analysts posit that if Belarus were drawn fully into war, its forces would suffer heavy losses. Economically, the country faces stagnation, high dependence on Russian subsidies, and structural economic challenges. Politically, this limits its ability to project power or absorb the costs of war. Diplomatically, Belarus is increasingly isolated in the West, sanctioned, tied to Russia's agenda, and therefore lacks independent maneuverability. All this means its performance in a conflict scenario is weak by design, yet its strategic value remains high because of geography and alignment. Next, safety features. What safeguards exist for Belarus and for the wider region? On one level, Belarus holds some deterrent value. Its alliance with Russia, the hosting of Russian nuclear weapons, mutual defense treaties, all act as a shield for Moscow, and therefore indirectly for Minsk. For example, Lukashenko has stated that Belarus would respond to external aggression using everything it has. On the other hand, safety features for Belarus's population are minimal. The authoritarian regime suppresses dissent, so internal safety in terms of civil liberties is low. From the regional safety viewpoint, Belarus's alignment with Russia and its location increase risk. The presence of Russian troops, nuclear weapons, proximity to Ukraine, and NATO borders mean that any spillover or escalation from Ukraine's front could hit Belarus. Analysts warn that if Belarus enters the war or is used as a staging ground, the consequences for civilians and for regional stability would be severe. Therefore, the safety features are asymmetric: strong deterrence via Russia, but weak protection of own population and high exposure to conflict risk. Moving to unique selling points, why Belarus matters and why the question "Is Belarus the next Ukraine?" is not rhetorical but substantive. First, Belarus offers territory. It's a launch pad for military operations into Ukraine from the north, and it sits adjacent to NATO states and the Baltic region, which means it can open a second front or stretch Ukraine's defenses. Analysts have flagged its geography as vital. Second, Belarus's alignment with Russia. By allowing Russian forces in and by participating, Belarus becomes a force multiplier for Moscow. This has unique strategic significance. If Belarus actively engages in war, the balance in Ukraine could shift. Third, it represents the risk of spillover. If Belarus's internal instability or coercion by Russia triggers a conflict, the war may expand into Europe's next frontier. Fourth, Belarus also offers a test case for authoritarian regimes under stress. How such a regime behaves when pulled into war and whether it remains stable or collapses implications beyond Europe. These points make Belarus more than just another country near Ukraine. It is a linchpin. Next, price. What is the cost of this scenario? Cost to Belarus, to Russia, to Ukraine, to the region. For Belarus, the cost of being used as a front or becoming the next Ukraine is huge: risk of large-scale military invasion, destruction, sanctions, loss of independence. Some analysts argue that Russia could force Belarus into war or absorb it entirely. For Ukraine, the price of Belarus being active in the war is higher burdens, stretched fronts, new vulnerable axes. For Russia, the price is the burden of another theater of war, more resources drained, more international condemnation, more sanctions. One analyst said adding Belarus may bring Russia closer to deep crisis or even collapse. For the West and the region, the price is greater instability, potential for war on NATO frontiers, nuclear escalation risk. Thus, being the next Ukraine means expensive consequences across multiple dimensions. Finally, my conclusion: is Belarus the next Ukraine? The short answer: it could be, but it is not inevitable. Belarus is not Ukraine in terms of political identity, war experience, or reform trajectory. Analysts emphasize that certainly Belarus is not Ukraine. Nonetheless, because of its geography, dependence on Russia, weak domestic safety nets, and strategic importance in the Russia-Ukraine war, Belarus is at serious risk of becoming a front line much like Ukraine was in 2014 and 2022. If the Kremlin decides to escalate via the Belarus northern axis, or if domestic crisis in Belarus triggers Russian intervention, we could see Belarus turning into a conflict zone. The performance indicators show Belarus is ill-prepared for full-scale war, which means the human cost could be steep. The safety features are weak for its population, and the price of conflict would be high for all parties. Therefore, for viewers of Conflict Zone, Belarus should be watched as a key pivot. It may not yet be the next Ukraine, but under the right or rather wrong set of circumstances, it could become one. The war clouds are gathering, and Belarus is under them. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, don't forget to subscribe and like, and I will see you next time here on Conflict Zone.